So that's going to get us down to item 18. It's the public hearing. And it's the public hearing number 2 regarding the composition of the city's voting districts pursuant to California Elections Code, Section 1001A, and it's an adoption of a resolution approving line drawing criteria for establishment of the city council district boundaries. Do we have a staff report on that?
Yes, we do.
Will you do that?
Yes, I'll do the staff report. But before I start, what I want to remind everybody once again is that Spanish interpretation is available, and I'll ask one of our interpreters to step forward and remind the audience of that as well.
Hay un servicio de traducción simultánea para aquellos que solo hablan español y estén interesados en poder seguir la audiencia pública que va a haber para el nuevo sistema de elección por distritos en la ciudad de Camarillo.
If you wouldn't mind really speaking into that microphone, it's not real, just really. Would you mind repeating? I'm sorry.
Hay un servicio de traducción simultánea al español para aquellos que solo hablen español y deseen seguir la audiencia pública que se va a celebrar en este momento sobre el nuevo sistema de elección por distritos en la ciudad de Camarillo.
Thank you.
Just as a reminder, I want to let everybody know that this is not a one-and-done process. In fact, we're only at our second public hearing for this process, and we have many more to go. I would implore everybody to watch these dates and to please participate. Once again, as we're looking at the composition of the districts, there are several mandatory criteria. We have mentioned those before. We will continue to mention those. Once again, the district shall be as nearly equal in population as possible. Race cannot be the predominant factor or criteria, and we have to, of course, comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. As mentioned previously, there are also several optional criteria that are available, including topography, geography, cohesiveness, contiguity, integrity, and compactness of territory, communities of interest, visible boundaries, both natural and man-made, to avoid pairing of incumbents, and consideration of areas of new residential development and occupancy since the 2010 census. Another item which we're all aware of is that Council will also need to decide the method of selection of the mayor and the composition of the City Council. In essence, at its most simple, you can have 5, 7, or 9 districts for members of City Council, with the mayor selected by the City Council on an annual basis, or 4, 6, or 8 districts for members of the City Council with the mayor elected at large by the voters. Regarding the item of growth since the 2010 census, it's very difficult to encapsulate that and to bring it into the process itself. So what I've done is overlaid on one of the maps provided by our consultants areas where we've had growth or are expecting growth prior to the 2020 election. On the very left over here is Springville. You can see that we estimate there's approximately 3244 residents in that area. And the Village at the Park area, we're estimating just over 2,300 residents. And coming soon in this area up here, the Shea Homes development will be almost 800 residents. So though these numbers aren't rolled into the process at this time, it won't impact the 2020 election. However, it may impact the districting after the 2020 census. And so this is provided for your information as you're looking at the maps, recognizing where the primary growth areas are. Our consultant tonight may talk to several of the tools that are available. This is one of them, a one-page kit that can be used by the public to draw their own districts and submit maps. This is another which can be used with a spreadsheet. This is population unit ID numbers tied to a spreadsheet so people know how many people are living in each one of these areas. And with that brief presentation, what we're looking for tonight is for City Council to receive public comment regarding the composition of the City Council voting districts and the criteria for those districts. We're also looking for you to approve the resolution with any revisions determined appropriate by City Council, adopting the line drawing criteria for the establishment of the district boundaries and the desired number of districts. And finally, we're also looking for a motion for you to direct our demographer, NDC, to prepare up to 4 district election maps for consideration at the next hearing on April 24th. And at this point, what I would like to do is turn it over to our demographer to walk through the process.
Again, if you wouldn't mind really putting that microphone up to you so we can really all.
Thank you. Sure, Mr. Mayor, no
Thank
problem.
you very much.
My name is Robert McIntyre. I'm with National Demographics. I'm your demographer this evening. And the purpose of this second public hearing is much like the first public hearing, is to inform the council and the community on the criteria for drawing maps, but primarily to start the conversation around the idea of communities of interest. So how does your community and how do you as council members define communities of interest? And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, but first we're going to do a little primer. I think I owe the Assistant City Clerk a dollar because he took a lot of my thunder from the presentation. But it'll be good to hear more than once because it's not intuitive to people who don't do this for a living. So as you heard, one of the major concepts we have to talk about when we're drawing up maps is we have to look at the California Voting Rights Act, and one of the major changes that you see from the California Voting Rights Act as compared to the Federal Voting Rights Act is the California Voting Rights Act got rid of 2 tests that were within the Federal Voting Rights Act that made it virtually impossible, at least to date, to defend a lawsuit or a claim under the California Voting Rights Act. And so as you've seen with other jurisdictions who have tried to defend themselves against a claim, they found it very, very challenging the way the law is written, because the law was written by an attorney who filed a federal claim, spent a year of his life pursuing it, and got $19,000. And so when he wrote this law, he made sure he was going to get paid. And a couple of their attorneys have followed suit and managed to now are making a living quite handsomely doing this. You're not new to this process. You're not the first, and you certainly won't be the last. Camarillo will be, the 117th city, but we probably have 30 to 40 other cities in process as well right now. A lot of business around this activity. I have to say, I wish we were doing it in a manner when jurisdictions weren't being forced under a timeline to do it, because that's not the healthiest way to do it. It doesn't allow for the best engagement between your community and you, the council, who you represent. But the law is written in a way that does require a minimum of 4 of these public engagement sessions, and this is the second. So as you can see here, many jurisdictions have started the process of switching or have completed, as what you see here. On the bottom left, you see some of the monies of the most recent cases that plaintiffs have spent trying to defend. So Palmdale is often put up as the big case, the test that went all the way through trial, and it's a big case to point out for 2 reasons, not necessarily just to scare jurisdictions by, wow, look at all this money. Palmdale had to pay the plaintiff $4.7 million in legal fees, but they also spent about $2 million of their own money with their attorneys, so they spent near $7 million, which is scary on the face of it, but what's even scarier is the court implemented a map that the city had no input in. And so the important part about, I want to kind of praise you for really pushing under safe harbor to ensure that you and your community don't lose control of your mapping choices. And so when you look at the schedule laid out by staff, the schedule is laid out to be a bit aggressive, but it falls within what's called the safe harbor provision to ensure that you and your community have control over an adopted map and no court can implement one for you. So you saw the dates listed on the prior timeline, and we'll put those dates into this slide and resend it back to the city so they can post it on the city's website, which the city has staff has already created a website around this process. Very important. Every presentation that occurs will take place, will be put on there. So when we start talking about mapping, we have to talk about 2 different areas. The Federal Voting Rights Act, which requires first and foremost that when we draw jurisdictions or districts, that they have roughly equal population according to the last census. And as you heard previously, the last census was in 2010, and boy, have you had a lot of development since then, or you have a lot in the works. And so it can feel a bit counterintuitive when we're talking about such old numbers, but the law is unequivocal. We must use the 2010 numbers. But knowing what development is in process or near completion or will soon be completed will be great input and weigh in just as heavily as the data in the 2010 census when the 2020 census comes out in 2021. So the maps you adopt in this process will be in place for one election. You'll do this process, though you're allowed to do a much more abbreviated version of it, in 2021, and that map you adopt then will be in place for the 2022 election. When we look at the federal voting rights law, we also Voting Rights Act, we also have to make sure that race is not the predominant concern when drawing a district. And so we'll talk about protected class voters and what that means, and using the citizen voting rights, the citizen voting age population. We'll look at the racial demographic to talk about certain parts of town, but that's one consideration. Really, how you draw your maps is a policy decision. And the only time race really comes into play is you can't intentionally dilute the voting strength of a protected class of voters. So we're not looking to necessarily jam them all together and get a super high number, but we're also we have to draw maps and make sure that we don't minimize their voting strength at the polls as well. So when we talk about communities of interest, the idea is really to talk about what would potentially be a policy decision. And so the policy decisions, driving your mapping around policy decisions in communities will help you avoid the racial gerrymandering legality. Now, I will tell you, you will get communities members that come up here and say, gosh, if I draw a map that separates all of the council members, that's gerrymandering, because in their mind, gerrymandering is any map they don't like. We will define gerrymandering for you. So when you're at the grocery store and somebody brings it up, you'll have something to say. So aside from the Federal Voting Rights Act, we do have the hard criteria. We have the traditional districting criteria, and so communities of interest is a big one, and we'll dive into that one a little bit. But when we draw maps, we want to make sure they're compact. When we talk about compactness, you want to think as close to a circle as you can get. That's a perfectly compact area. So we're looking for not having a lot of unnecessary jagged lines reaching out, or fingers, we call them, reaching across the map to grab a particular part of an area. That's where it starts to look funny. We have to make sure areas are contiguous, so you can't have one district separating another district into two pieces. To the extent we can, we want to use natural man-made boundaries. Obviously, high-speed surface streets, the big roads that cut through town, those are natural dividing lines. But you also have mountains and foothills in this area, and those are sometimes used as dividing lines as well because they're natural boundaries. And then, of course, to the extent that we can draw legally compliant maps and respect the will of the voters in the last election, we want to do that. So we don't go out of our way to pair incumbents. But sometimes if they happen to live on the same side of the same street, well, then it's impossible not to. So we're going to talk a fair bit about demographics as we look at the maps, because we want to talk about protected class voters. And under the California Voting Rights Act, which, keep in mind, was originated in cities like the central part of the state, where you have large farming populations, where the city council was historically 5 white males, but 90% of the community was non-white. And that's how this law came about. So when we talk about protected class voters, we're talking about Latinos, American Indians, Asians, and African Americans. Those are the major groups spelled out in the California Voting Rights Act. It doesn't mean Caucasians can't qualify as a protected voting class, but they won't in your jurisdiction. And so when we look at the jurisdiction, we're looking at the 2010 numbers. In the top box here, we see the total population, roughly 65,201 in 2010. And roughly 23% of that was Latino in 2010, 62% Caucasian, 2% African American, and 11% Asian American. We also have the citizen voting age populations from 2012 to 2016. And the citizens voting age population, the second box on the left there, is what a plaintiff would use when they're looking at maps to determine whether or not there's dilution. And so when we're looking at roughly 19% of the citizen voting age population is Latino, 10% Asian American, and 2% African American. Well, depending on if there are clusters or groups within different parts of town of these protected class voters, it's probably likely to draw at least one district that has a majority or a plurality of voting strength within a district. And so to the extent that can be done while meeting other policy concerns, then you'd want to do that. You wouldn't want to go out of your way to ensure that's not possible or dilute. And so on the left, we kind of break down what the relevant numbers are regarding voting. And we're going to show you on the next page where these different constituencies are located. But for example, if you were to stay with a 5 council member council as you have now, we would be looking to draw districts that have roughly 13,040 per district. Now, obviously, since we have to use census block data from 2010, we're not going to get 13,040 perfectly 5 times. And so the law does allow for a little bit of variance, up to 10% variance. So let's say I undersize one district by 3% and I oversize the next one by 2%, then the variance would be 5%. So it's the lowest plus the absolute value of the highest equals the maximum of 10%. There's a lot of other great data in here that I like to look at. So when you look at the average incomes, the housing status, multifamily versus single family, you also have education, language fluency, language spoken at home, and immigration status. The data I see here speaks very much of stability and a lot to be proud of in the local community. So if you don't have access to this data, it's often fun to share. So when we're looking at protected class voters and where they live, this will play into how we're mapping. And we want to make sure to the extent we can, we're not going out of our way to dilute voting strength. We see that with Asian American voters in the Northwest, there's a relatively big window. And I know this was one of the areas that was pointed at for recent housing starts. And so according to the 2010 census, there wasn't a ton of people living in the West, but it's a significant enough statistical number that we'll have to look out for it. And then, of course, in the Northeast part of town as well. That color blue box represents 25 to 30% of those census blocks being Asian Americans. Then when we look at the Latino populations, we see that along the west side of Lewis Road and the railroad, especially where the 101 meets, we see the highest density populations. And the highest densities would be reds, yellows, and greens. And there is one big red block on the southeast side of town, but there's only 11 people that live in that. So while you see the big bright red block, it looks important. Statistically, it's not going to play in very heavily to how we map, how we draw maps. And there were no large concentration of African Americans or Native American eligible voters within the jurisdiction. And one of the things I love, nothing more than I love seeing, is when you see a wide disbursement when you look at these types of maps. And there's pretty good disbursement. So what it shows is people feel comfortable living throughout town, and that's a good thing. So back to the ideas of communities of interest, because this is one that's not so clearly defined in the law. What it can't be is purely race, but what it can be is just about everything else. So a community of interest could be things like your school attendance boundaries. Some people are really tied to their local elementary school, for example, especially if they have school-age children. Natural dividing lines, or even things, man-made things like parks. I know I live near a park where people do Tai Chi, and that park is its own special community. And the people who live around it walk a pretty substantial distance to go there, and they consider themselves a community. That's also acceptable. But you could have other things, like if you've got a bunch of USC or UCLA people, boy, they probably think they're a community. So it just really depends on what the local community defines it as. So that's part of the reason we have these public hearings, and I'll be sitting over on the side taking notes as the public comes up, is because I want to hear what they say a community of interest is to them, because we'll try to account for that in our mapping. One other consideration around communities of interest is often communities of interest want to be put together to maximize their voting strength with one council member. But occasionally we see communities of interest that want to be separated. Usually we see this with senior centers, where we've got high propensity voters and they want to have 2 council members that are beholden to them. And so sometimes we see that perspective as well. So just because there's a community of interest it does help us to know if they really want to be grouped together or if they see a value in actually being split in some way and what that would look like in their mind. We also want to give some examples because you've provided 3 tools for your local community to actually draw maps, and I thought you might find it interesting to know as of 5 o'clock tonight, 6 maps have already been submitted to National Demographics. We've received one from Roy Villa, one from Roger Sage, one from Bill Taber, one from Michael Colley, and 2 from anonymous sources. So 6 maps already, which at this stage is healthy public input and engagement. So that's something definitely to be proud of. When we're looking at maps, we talked about a couple concepts. So for example, these are examples of compact maps. You've got Compton City on the left, and that essentially looks like 4 rectangles. And just the little jutting areas you see coming out, those are population balances only. And so those are just for the purposes of population balancing. So when you think of the size of a district within your community, obviously one district's going to look bigger than another district if there's fewer people in it, or the density is lower. So where you have really high density downtown areas, you're going to have small districts. On the right, you see Glendale Unified School District, which has Glendale and La Crescenta in the north. The space where there's essentially no people along the mountain ridge there, that's a natural man-made dividing line that was used to divide kind of the north and south. The North Crescenta Valley families felt like they were a unique community, and it was mapped that way. And then the way the downtown area was broken up was done in a way to account for unique communities. So people along the 5 freeway, even though they kind of crossed the 134, wanted to be in their own area, whereas people on the mountainside over here felt like they were a unique area. And so the maps were able to account for each of those groups as they gave their input. But there are other ways to do this. For example, some, especially cities, like to take, occasionally like to kind of spread the business district across, or they like the idea of having a good cross-section of their community. So in Pasadena, you see all the council members touch Colorado Boulevard. In South Pasadena, the idea was to have a broad socioeconomic for each council member. So nobody owned the economic hub, nobody owned the wealthiest part, nobody owned the least wealthy part. There are no poor parts in South Pasadena that I've seen. But in the end, it was an attempt to try to grab a diverse cross-section, and that was the policy decision made there. On the top right, we have Central Unified School District. You have the city center along the freeway, and then you have very rural farming areas. And so a very similar choice. Everybody touches the business area, everybody touches the farming area, because neither one was more important than the other. Everybody needed, this kind of idea of fairness or equity across the council members. Now, the council has opted to provide 3 mapping tools for the community. Obviously, your community's already gotten a real good head start on this. One of them is taking a PDF map that's available on the website and in the council offices in City Hall, where they can take the populations and start adding up till they get to that 13,000 number, group those two together, draw a line around them, and then just keep doing that across the map until they have their 5 districts, for example. Another one is to take the population unit ID. So here's an example of the participation kit with population numbers. So for example, if you were to start in the west, you just start adding 1,000, 1,500, 1,600, 2,000, 3,000. So very quickly, just start working your way across. You're going to hit 13,000 right over in here without the new housing tracks. And you just keep working your way across until you have your 5 districts according to council blocks. Now, these individual units are not each one census block. These are groups of census blocks because there are much smaller census blocks within there. The online tool allows you to go to a much granular level, but most people don't like the learning curve it takes to get over to get into that mapping software. The ones who do will tend to make a lot of maps. But this is probably the most accessible tool you have because anybody who can read the writing, and occasionally I have to put on my glasses now that I'm over 40 to see some of it, but most of us can kind of start outlining and picking groups of 13,000 and drawing our maps. The next one uses the same map, but instead of having population numbers, it's got unit ID numbers. So population 1 still equals the 1,000 people that are in population area 1 on the other kit, except you would use Excel and put in district numbers next to each population unit number, and as long as the population unit numbers touch each other, so they're contiguous, you're okay. So you can keep selecting. So for example, if I'm going to start on the left and start building District 1, I'm going to start putting 1s in each population unit ID number that touches each other to build the map that I want to build. The benefit of doing it this way with Excel is when you fill in the yellow chart on the side and get all of the unit ID numbers into their own respective districts, you will have an output with all of that demographic data by district that we just looked at, but by each individual council district. So it will auto-populate all of that information by council district for you. And you can see, have I built a majority protected class district? Have I not? If I start to see where those protected classes live, have I accidentally split them when I should have grouped them together, and where would I carve off and make those trade-offs? So it'll allow for that kind of thoughtful approach that it's a little harder to do with a population only. And then finally, we have the online tool. Now, this has the steepest initial learning curve, but people who do actually do it tend to produce far more maps. And this allows you to go down to the census block level. and choose individual census blocks, whereas the other two versions gave you grouped census blocks. We tried to create them in manageable sizes, bite sizes as we call them. And so there is a tutorial on your districting website that actually speaks to how to use this. Some of the things we want to look at is we've got area. So we've drawn areas to the boxes here. These boxes collapse, and so you have to actually, when you start, you have to push them out. But when you create a login, your city map will come up at the census block level, and essentially you'll be able to choose which districts you want to build by selecting territories. And so, for example, when we look at number 2 here, this is where you'd start a new district. After you've built your next district, you'd start a new district. And the previous one you've labeled like District 1, we'll say 1, so you can go back and make edits, or you can keep clicking into new districts as you're building. Coming down here on number 3, these are tools for picking census blocks. My favorite tool is the zigzag one, because you can click as you're dragging the mouse through the map. It's like if I click through through census blocks, I can go back and forth, up and down, side to side, just keep clicking, and when I'm done, I double click, and it'll grab everything every census block those lines have touched and group them together. As you do that, the information that you're compiling is going to show up right here. And it's going to tell you what the total population is, what the ideal population is, how many you've grabbed, and if you're over or short. And so the nice thing is, you keep building till you get to the size you're looking for, roughly 13,000. But let's say you click a census block that's a little too big. Well, you hold the control button and click that same census block, and it'll take that one right back out, so you don't have to start over. And I know this seems like a lot just looking at a screenshot, but when you start playing with it, it comes together pretty quickly. Looking at number 5, this provides the demographic change of the currently selected area, and number 4 is the areas as you're building them. So it'll show District 1, District 2, District 3 as you're building them. And then finally, once you're finished building your maps, you want to make sure you do a plan integrity check before you submit. Now, when you hit submit, if there are any plan integrity problems, like you've missed any census blocks, it's going to tell you and allow you to put them in the right district that you want. But it's also going to allow you to put in some notes. So one of the most important things, not only for this map, but the paper maps that we can have, because a lot of people will draw maps, but they really care about one district or 2 districts. They don't necessarily care about the whole part of town. So if people write on their map what was important to them when they were drawing their maps, that's very valuable because, one, the council will see it because it'll be included in the notes. But also, if very often the final map that's adopted is some amalgamation of maps. So a lot of times we'll hear, gosh, we really like this part of this map, we like this part of another map. Can you draw one that puts these together? And you'll have feedback from the community members who have drawn maps to help make those decisions or to give you that feedback. Oftentimes, community members who draw maps will come up and explain to you why they drew it the way they did. We always try to present the notes given to us with fidelity, but they're not going to write an essay on why they drew it, and they can certainly come up for 3 minutes and explain it to you to the best of their ability on why they made the choices they made. Because often that conversation will spur a lot of things in other community members, and you will get a real sense of what those communities of interest are as you start trying to whittle your way down on the number of maps. And so this is the second pre-draft public hearing. As a council, you're required to have 2 of these, so you've met the legal requirement. And so now we've got to start drawing maps. And so as your community and National Demographics starts drawing maps, we want to take the notes from tonight from the public hearing on what people consider communities of interest. We want to hear if those communities of interest want to be united or divided. And we also want to find out where maybe some neighborhoods feel like they belong together. A lot of times that has to do with when their housing tract was built or other things. Maybe there's a parade or a program in their area that they really feel like they're neighbors and they belong together. And so we'll try to take that input in, and all maps that are going to be published for discussion need to be received by the city 10 days before the next meeting. So we have time to process them. We will get them in an online viewer that allows the members, council members, and the city to log on and actually zoom in, zoom out. They can put in their address and see which district they would live in. It's a really neat viewing tool. But they'd also be printed. So we need about 3 days to do that because they have to be published on the city's website at least 7 days before you're legally allowed to talk about them. So if we receive a map 6 days before the meeting, we'll certainly process it, but you can't talk about it at that next meeting. You have to wait till the following meeting. So the timeline's kind of important because it's set in statute. With that, before we turn it over to the community to hear about communities of interest, do you have questions before, or would you like to wait till after the?
Any questions at this time? As long as you're up there, maybe this would be appropriate time. Are there any questions? Mr. Mulchay?
When it comes to those deadlines, 10 days prior to the next public hearing in which those maps will be discussed, what are you guys doing in terms of trying to communicate those deadlines to residents through these tools? And
What we'll do is we'll do the 10-day count back and provide those to staff so they can put it on the districting webpage that says to be seen at the next public meeting, it must be submitted by this date and time for each of the dates coming up.
okay.
Any other questions at this time? I have just one. So specifically, what will you need from us tonight? For instance, will you need to know the amount of districts that we're talking about here tonight? Is there a timeline for that? Is there some criteria that we need to meet for that, or anything else you can think of?
Well, I would suggest that the sooner you have a decision, and I would wait till after you've heard public comments before you have that conversation, but the sooner the council has decided regarding the number of districts and the at-large or not at-large mayor, the better, because then people won't feel like they've wasted time drawing maps that are not that. So if the community and council says, gosh, we love our 5-district rotating, then that's what we're going to do. Well, then you certainly don't want community members to draw 8-district maps with an at-large mayor, because they will have wasted a lot of time and energy and may be resentful over that.
Okay. Any other questions? Ms. Santiago?
I have a comment to make.
Would you like to make a comment?
With regards to the 10 days that the speaker mentioned, we've actually, my understanding is, need the maps in sooner than 10 days before, and that is referenced in the agenda report on big page 4, where it's mentioned that if we look to the 4th full paragraph, for the May 22nd hearing, for example, the maps would need to be in by May 9th in order for them then to be published. And so the timeline, that's, I think, 13 days before rather than 10 days before. So I did want to make that correction so that nobody is counting 10 days before.
Thank you.
Ms. Santangelo had a question. Proceed, please.
Two-part question. First of all, it's not required that we've decided how many districts or what the format would be to go forward.
No, ma'am.
If we were to whittle it down to, say, 2 choices, could there be some benefit to having the public designing both formats so that we could, you know, who knows, maybe it would turn out that after trial and error, you see that this way doesn't work or this way works better, or so I'm just looking at, you know, if that's a possibility and if that made any sense to you with your experience.
To the extent that you can limit the options, and I don't mean that in a negative way, because you are going to hear from your community in just a second, but to the extent we narrow the types of maps drawn, it will focus the conversation. Because unfortunately, when you have too many options, it becomes really difficult to whittle the conversation down, and we get caught up in the semantics, and everybody wants to go straight to sequencing of elections, when really you want to decide on a map type and policy decisions, and then sequencing follows that when you've kind of narrowed the list down. Because if you try to talk about sequencing of 30 different maps and you don't have term limits, gosh, it can get real interesting real fast.
And the sequencing, obviously, would only be able to be done after we've, well, never mind.
It would depend if there's pairing. So the reason it gets real interesting real fast is because some communities members will go out of their way to try to pair council members when they draw maps. It always happens. Somebody has a beef, and they'll do that. And that's an option. But when they do that and they pair council members who are on different election cycles, then it creates a different set of possibilities that becomes much more complex when we're talking about many, many possibilities. And so that's why we really try to help narrow down the policy decisions around the structure of the council before we, and then if we can get to a policy type. For example, you saw different mapping options. Sometimes you'll see this interesting kind of a central section and then a kind of a donut of districts around it. That's a policy type depending on the density and makeup of your town. There are other different types of maps, but you may see a common vein rise to the surface very quickly that just sits well with all of you and the community. Well, in that case, we narrow down to those, and then we have sequencing conversations about the maps that fall within those policy choices. And then it gets much, much more feasible, because people don't get lost in the semantics of the how and why. Did that answer your question? Absolutely.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, I do have some cards here, and I'll call you up as they were submitted to me. First is Barbara Williams. Barbara's here. Welcome. Again, Barbara, 3 minutes. And let me turn that microphone. Yes, it's on for you. There you go.
You indicated you wanted 5 districts without an elected mayor. Well, shame on you. It should be what the citizens want, not what you want. The council made an egregious mistake by not implementing the safe harbor provision to limit your legal liability to $30,000. I know 2 members were not part of that decision, but 3 of you were. You took away our ability to fight the lawsuit. It was a frivolous lawsuit with no proof that a protected class was neglected. No, most of us don't want to go to districting, and no, most of us don't think it's a good thing. So you have no right to force districts into your mold, but are obligated to do it the way we want. 5 districts would be like setting up 5 subsidies or fiefdoms. That would promote competition for resources and decisions that are not in the best interests of the entire city. Dr. Dixon provided a suggestion at the last meeting since he was not aware of the February 27 meeting. Well, a lot of us were not aware, as indicated by only 2 public comments. We don't read the Star or Acorn anymore due to biases and inaccurate information, and many people don't drive by the City Hall or survey the website to address issues. The way to get out information in the city is through the trash bills. Many of us in the city have either DirecTV or Dish and do not have the community access channel. So Mr. Pirrick, when you give the excuse that you've gotten the information out, you need to use methods that will ensure the majority of the population do get the info. I have been speaking with friends and neighbors, and the majority of the people are in agreement with Dr. Dixon and want 4 districts and an at-large elected mayor. Both Sean and Susan did surveys that came up with the same results. So are you too going to listen to what the people have said and vote as your surveys suggest? This will ensure that each citizen has 2 representatives on the council, with 1 representing everyone in the city. To take it from the citizens' ability to vote for all 5 to just 1 means less accountability. And it only takes a small number of votes to elect a council member. When people submit maps, they can provide rationale for boundaries and special interest areas. You should not be deciding that for us. You screwed up on this already, and for once, listen to what the people want. Since the council forced us into districting, do as we desire. Choose 4 districts with an at-large elected mayor. We have the ability to choose a mayor and determine whether they would be ethical for that job. If being mayor is important to you, then run for mayor. To ensure that elections with typically higher voter turnout do not overshadow typically lower turnout elections, the mayor term should be 2 years, so the mayor is elected at each 4-year election cycle. Again, give the public the opportunity to decide what they want and quit forcing your own positions on us. The people in this city are very smart. 4 districts and an at-large elected mayor is Los Personas' decision.
Thank you for your comments. Next is Matt Lorimer. Right here. Again, Matt, 3 minutes if you would. I appreciate it, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm for 4 districts and elected mayor. Let me tell you why. I lived here for 20 years. I ran for city council 3 times. I sit in the audience when there was 1 person, 3 people, or when something went really bad and they didn't want a development, it was full of people. I also helped with term limits. I was 1 of 20 people. So let's look at the history of Camarillo. We're about to make changes in the city, so let's look what has gone wrong. Our last city attorney cost us money. We had the Fiesta scandal. We had the desalt plant, 15 years. Empty firehouse for 20 years. A lot of bad decisions. When we had a rotating mayor, when I sit down here, some of the people that were mayor were low energy. It's my time of year, we're rotating it out again. But let's look at what got done. Nothing got done. The citizens of Camarillo made a determination last year, and over a period of time, they basically threw out 3 city councilmen. You know why? Because they were no longer happy with not getting things done in the city. Scandals, excuses, You know, poor government, people got tired of it finally because they want a better system. Today, we're talking about why we should elect a mayor. You know why? If you do a rotating, does Walmart rotate their CEO? Do companies just say, hey, you want to be a CEO off the floor? No. They want somebody with drive and passion. When you want to be a mayor, we want to see you fight it out for it. We want to see vision. We want to see accomplishments. We want to see projects done, not dragged out for 15 years. That is why you need to elect a mayor. Somebody that has passion, drive, who sets the tone here. Because that's not what's gone on in the city for many years. I've been here. I've seen what goes on. The rotating mayor doesn't work. If it worked, the city wouldn't have a desalt plant. For 15 years, we wouldn't be talking about it. We wouldn't be talking about empty buildings. We wouldn't be talking about failures at the city hall. And you know why? Rotating a mayor doesn't work. If it worked, we wouldn't have got rid of 3 councilmen. Think about it. What we need here is somebody who has drive and passion, who has goals, and that way we can hold them accountable. If you don't get those things done, you're gone. We're not going to elect you mayor because you need a leader. Any organization, do you know, any business, do you know they just, hey, you want to be in charge, want to be president, CEO? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. They pick the best. And who picks the best? The citizens. Did you read a mayor, if you look this up, the definition, is an elected head of a city or municipality. Elected. That's what you need. Just like you elect a president, you get rid of them every 4 years if you don't like them. We need a leadership. You know why? We want to drive and get things done in the city because it's not working under, let's rotate the mayor this week. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. By the way, this is an advertised public hearing. I'm going to open it, and I'm going to make sure that all of these comments that have been made by the first 2 speakers are part of the public record. With that, a Colleen Steed, I believe. It's Colleen, yes. Welcome. Again, if you would keep it to 3 minutes, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. I just want to thank, as a Camarillo resident for over 30 years, I appreciate all of what our city staff and our city council have done for our city. We are now faced with a change as a result of what some would consider a poorly written legislation. The California Voters' Right Act has brought Camarillo to the requirement of district-based elections. This will reduce the number of city council members that a resident will vote on. I look at the maps and think our community spans a geographic landscape with our various populations. I know in our litigious nature, this has brought new requirements, but we need to replace like with like. Think, if you will, not setting the districts by number of seated city council members. Rather, think how we can maximize our city voice. In the last election, we were able to vote for 3. With a district-based 5 zones, I will vote for 1, and sometimes none. I respectfully request that you go to a 4 city council member with an at-large voting mayor elected every 2 years. This will give voters at least 1 vote each election. You are letting Camarillo residents control what is going on and will let us resolve an issue that has been forced on our community. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next is Larry Davis. Larry here tonight. Again, Larry, 3 minutes and welcome.
Thank you, Mayor and council members and staff. I recognize that we have a council city manager form of government, and I think that system should be maintained with 5 elected council members and the mayor selected from those 5. My concern is if you have a strong mayor position, that person will then become the administrator and force unduly influence on the city staff. It's worked well since 1964 with the council city manager form, and I think it can work that way in the future. I worked for the city for 30 years. I saw how the council worked in rotating the mayor position, and I think it worked well. It's time to retain that form of government and not really switch to a strong mayor influence on the city manager and the staff. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next is Bev Dransfeld. Bev, yes, she is. Okay. Again, Bev, 3 minutes if you would, and welcome.
Good evening. I'm not here to repeat anything I said before. You all know the points that I've brought up and my position. Many California cities are having to complete some form of districting. This can work to Camarillo's advantage by having discussions with other neighboring cities who have already gone through the process. Simi Valley recently completed their districting maps. I spoke with one of their council members to ask for any advice that she may have or some complications Simi Valley ran into. I mentioned how tonight the decision was going to be made about how many districts and if Camarillo would have an elected at-large mayor. The council member explained their process. The council left it up to the residents to decide by creating their own maps with a variety number of districts. This gave them the opportunity to see the benefits or downsides in each scenario. As residents become more hands-on and there are more workshops presented, it gives Camarillo an opportunity to learn more as to what's at stake. I ask that the council please consider this, as the public is still coming to terms with districting. Before decisions are made on the number of districts or if there should be an elected mayor, it is important to understand the duties of the mayor currently, what would change, if anything, with 5 districts, or if there would be an increase in responsibilities with an at-large elected mayor. I don't believe it is fair to make a decision tonight without clarity on the mayorship. One of the concerns expressed at previous meetings is that an elected mayor may be given more power. Are there or will there be actual stipulations in place that will make this concern true? For example, can the mayor override a popular decision or selection for an appointed position? Moving forward with further public hearings and workshops, I'm not sure of the difference, but it appeared as though the courthouse hearing was successful with its publicity. Also, I think it would be an amazing opportunity to go to the actual neighborhoods and communities to receive public comments and create awareness. For example, holding town halls in places like Leisure Village, Camarillo Springs, Village at the Park, over at the YMCA Center, Mission Oaks, etc. During the 2018 election, I recall members of the Leisure Village community wanting town halls that weren't just centered around election time. This is the perfect opportunity to go to the people instead of them coming to City Hall. Las personas son la ciudad. We can make this true by thoroughly educating Camarillo and have them hands-on in the decision-making process by seeing what the city would actually look like with whichever number of districts. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments, and just part of the record, Bev, I did receive your email, and it's part of the record. All right, next is Neil Dixon. Again, Neil, 3 minutes if you would, and welcome.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to speak tonight. I appreciate the time that several of you have given to speak to me personally about this. I respect every one of you, and I know you're here to do the best you can for the city. And there's a sharp difference of opinion on what is best for the city. I think that all of you do know what my position is, and I favored 4 districts and an elected mayor. In January, when you voted to proceed with districting, as you were forced to, essentially, by this lawsuit, many of you, most of you, almost all of you, lamented the fact that we were losing the at-large system. We do have a way to maintain some portion of the at-large system, and that is to elect a mayor at large. And then the remaining 4 council members would be elected in their district, giving us the advantage of both districting and the at-large system in combination. The former, I believe, the assistant city manager just spoke to you about in opposition to the mayor, but he did use a legal term that I just learned recently. He used the term strong mayor. There is another legal term that you guys can use to define the powers of the mayor. That decision, the powers of the mayor, is entirely within your power right now. But the difficult decision you guys have to make, I think that there is a really key issue here, and the issue is is really there's what it's about and what it's not about. It's not about future candidates running for office. It's not about what some attorney in Malibu wants or the money that he wants to make. It's not about whether you all work well together or not. It's not about whether you would all like to rotate into the position of mayor or not. In fact, it's really not about you at all. It's about all of us. All of us who are not sitting up there, all of us who vote, all of us who care about this city, and all of us who want to be represented. You're offered two choices here: 5 districts and a mayor, or 4 without a mayor, or 4 districts with a mayor. Option 1 gives each voter 1 vote every other election cycle for 1/5 of the council. I don't think that gives us power. The other alternative gives us each one or 2 votes every election cycle. Which one of those systems gives us the most engagement in the system? I believe that having 2 votes is better than 1. That engages the voters more into the system. Which one is going to stimulate voter participation in the system? I think if they have a mayor to vote for, they have somebody to vote for, they're going to come out and vote. Which option gives us each the greatest participation in our government? I think that's pretty clear. If we are voting, we are participating, and we are part of the government. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay.
Nonverbals, okay. Next is Bill Little. Bill here tonight. Again, Bill, if you could keep it 3 minutes, and welcome.
Thank you for having this public hearing. My comments tonight is a result of 34 years as city manager in 5 cities. My recommendations are based upon my experience and includes 21 years of service in 3 cities that had directly elected mayors. I think it's very important that municipal organizations avoid unnecessary points of friction which could lead to conflict within the organization. A directly elected mayor with 4 council members elected from districts is likely to create several points of friction. The most obvious one is it elevates one council position over the other 4. An elected mayor's position has no more authority than any other council position, yet if you ask most citizens, they would be under the incorrect impression that the mayor runs the city. A person holding that title can serve as an advocate for citizens or causes, but they still only have 1 vote. Some mayors I work with cannot accept that because they have the title mayor, and therefore believe that more is expected of them. And therefore, they attempt to form alliances within the council or attempt to force staff to agree to actions not approved by the council. Another issue that can result from friction between the mayor and city manager. In an effort to fulfill citizen expectations, elected mayors may try to exert themselves into the administration of the city and try to influence the decisions of city staff members. That is the responsibility of the city manager and ultimately as a city council. Another potential conflict between the mayor and council members is the term of the mayor. If the directly elected mayor is given a 4-year term, 2 council members will always be in a position to have to give up their seat in order to run against the mayor. If given a 2-year term so that all council members will have equal opportunity to challenge the mayor can be put in a position of having to conduct a very expensive campaign every 2 years. In contrast, Camarillo current city organization has very few conflict points. We have 5 equal council positions with a rotating mayor, elected by the council for a 1-year term, supported by an appointed city manager and staff. This has been the model of Camarillo city government since incorporation. It has served the city well over 50 years. It can easily be modified to add district elections. I urge you to continue this form of government. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your comments. Any questions? Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Next, I have 2 yellow cards, nonverbal, and they'll be passed among the council here. First, I believe it's Doug McDonald, and he said, I prefer 5 district with a rotating mayor, and the map should not take into consideration the current location of council members. Second, Libby Higgins has said, I am pro 5 districts. So I have 2 yellow cards. I'm going to pass them to the council members, and they will read them at this particular time. I do not have any more blue cards. Would anybody like to come up and say anything on this issue? This is an advertised public hearing, and after I close the hearing, we will not be reopening the public comment time. So if anybody would like to comment, this is really the time to do it. Yes, sir, if you would come up forward. Appreciate it. Let me pass this down. There you go. If you could hand that blue card in to Miss Madeline, I'd appreciate it. And let me announce your name if you wouldn't mind, sir. Oh, okay. Very well. And you know the 3 minutes, and I appreciate it. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My name is Timothy Sprinkles, Village at the Park. I've talked to some of the council members about this, tried to get educated about it, let them know my views. I'm impressed with Sean and Mrs. Sansangelo's effort to get a survey done, or a poll done to read what the public wants. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate all of you for your efforts here tonight and throughout this process. I want to suggest to the council that 4 districts makes sense to most of the people I've talked to with an elected at-large mayor. And the reason for that is I think the city voters right now would like to see a mayor or a mayoral race between people who have vision for where the city should go, and they should have an equal vote with the other council members. So I'm not opposed to that. Also, I think that the staff running the city, which Mr. Little referred to, is a good thing in some ways, but it also has a lot of the changes and things going on in this city being really run by people who are not beholden to the voters. And I think if you had a mayor with a vision who could lead this city, you'd have, in an election race, you'd have maybe 2, 3, 4 people running, and they could lay out their policies, lay out their platform, and the voters would then choose which way they wanted this city to go. So that's just my feeling about it. I respect all of you who feel that 5 districts and the residents here who want 5 districts. I understand that. But when you have a rotating mayor, I believe that each mayor who takes his seat has his own policies, he has his own platforms and direction for the city. And then the next year, you get a different mayor who may say, you know what, I don't believe in all that, or I don't want to go that way. And the end result is basically nothing happens, or you don't make progress. So I would like to see a new vision in the city, and I'd like to see the voters elect a mayor who has a vision that they prefer. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Let's see, do we have another? Yes. Oh, is that a yellow card? Oh, whoa. You okay? All right. All right, I do have another yellow card, a nonverbal from Jessica Romero, and she is no at-large mayor. I support the 5 districts. I will pass this around to the other council members at this time. Again, I'll make one other announcement. Is there anybody who would like to make a public comment on this issue before we close the public hearing, which will not be reopened? Would anybody else like to make a comment? Yes, sir. If you wouldn't mind stating your name, I'd appreciate it, sir.
Yes, Noe Villanueva, resident here.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I apologize for clapping. I just wasn't aware that was on the agenda and felt strongly about that. Being that this is the first meeting, I only had a couple hours to read up on the districting and everything else. I feel I represent a lot of the community that is unaware about this. So I can't really make a decision. But playing with the map earlier today at the office, 5 districts based on the 2022 census makes a lot of sense. But not having a mayor at large does not. So I'm conflicted there. And my question being is, when the new census comes out, will this be another option, or is this set in stone once this is decided between 4 or 5?
At the end of this, we can have some of those questions asked by our city attorney answered.
Okay, and I think there should be more outreach so community members know and don't have just limited time to research this and make informed decisions. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Would you mind filling out a blue card when you have a moment? Okay, again, anybody else out there before we close the public meeting on this would like to make a comment on this particular item? Okay, with that, we are going to close the public hearing. I will ask staff if there's any other comments or questions they need to make before we start our deliberations. And after that, I will ask council members if they have any questions of staff. So first, staff, is there anything?
I need to make a couple statements. Earlier, I mentioned about the deadline for the maps of being May 9th for the May 22nd hearing. I should also mention, as it's indicated in the agenda report, that for our hearing scheduled for April 24th of 2019, that the maps would need to be in by April 11th in order for those to be published and considered at that meeting. I also wanted to speak to the question I think some of the speakers asked about what the powers and duties of the mayor are. And so I can tell you that with a general law city, which is what you have in Camarillo, meaning as compared to a charter city. A charter city, for example, the city of Los Angeles has a charter, and a number of other cities do, but Camarillo does not. You have a general law city, so you're governed by the general laws. So in a general law city, the mayor is considered to be a member of the city council and has all the powers and duties of city council members. There are some provisions in the government code that have additional duties for the mayor. For example, the mayor is responsible for signing contracts that have been approved by the city council unless that has been delegated at the approval stage to the city manager. Elected mayors also, with the approval of the city council, if they're an elected mayor, which you can have with a general law city, they would make appointments to boards and commissions. We also in Camarillo have a number of city policies that deal with the duties of the mayor. That includes appointments of ad hoc committees. The mayor serves as the official representative and spokesperson for the city council to the media. The mayor is the presiding officer at city council meetings. So we have policies that establish those as being the duties of the mayor. And I felt that since that question had been asked, that it would be helpful if I gave that explanation. The so-called strong mayor is one that applies in a situation where you've got a charter city. For example, in a strong mayor form of government, the mayor might have the authority to hire and fire the city manager, and sometimes department heads may have authority to present a budget to the city council. Examples of a strong mayor form of government would include the city of San Diego is one example, the city of Oakland is another. So I believe that covers what I wanted to mention in terms of the mayor position. I'm seeing Councilmember Craven has a question.
Ms. Craven?
Well, the one man asked if every time we go through the new census, if you then decide again whether you're going to have an elected mayor and how many districts, and I think that's worthy of an answer.
You know, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can get back to you on that. I do know that for purposes of establishing the districts now, the government code gives the council the authority to make this decision, and I believe that applies for the 20 I know that applies to the 2020 election. And then when you get the new census, I just don't know from my own knowledge whether or not you would be able to change that later or not. But that doesn't really impact the decision that you are making tonight, I don't believe, legally, because the decision that you would be making tonight would govern the 2020 election. But I certainly at your next meeting can have an answer to your question about what the legal powers are with respect to the 2022 election going forward.
Okay. Any other questions of staff? Mrs. Santangelo, Ms. Santangelo, please.
I want to expand a little bit more on the powers of the mayor question. My understanding, and I want you to correct me or expand on what I say, is that regardless of whether we have 5 districts or 4 districts or whatever number, but 4 districts plus an at-large mayor, the mayor's, aside from the tasks essentially that you just listed, the mayor doesn't have any more authority or any more power to set the agenda or to have any more power to define the goals and objectives for the council or anything along those lines.
A mayor, as I had said, is a member of the city council. The mayor has 1 vote, the same as all the other council members.
Thank you.
Any other, Mr. Mulchay?
Brian, if we were to select 4 districts and an at-large mayor, or let's say just 4 districts and an at-large member, if in districting, if we were to have an at-large member of the council, that member must be designated mayor?
Yes, that's the way the code reads. Your choices are, you have an elected mayor, as it's indicated in the agenda report and the resolution. If you have an elected mayor, you could have 4, 6, or 8 districts, or if you don't have an elected mayor, you can have 5, 7, or 9 districts. Those are your choices. There's nothing recognized in the law about an at-large member.
And if you have an at-large mayor, is there anything that requires them, is anything that designates the term of that position?
You would need to make the decision of whether it's going to be 2 years or 4 years.
And to that end, to what extent would the most recently passed term limits, how would that impact, say, a 2-year term mayor?
The answer to that is that the law is not clear on whether that term limits would apply to an elected mayor. So if you choose to go with an elected mayor, then my recommendation would be to obtain clarity on the application of the term limits, in which you could do by presenting an ordinance to the people for a vote of the people as to whether or not they wish to apply the term limits to the elected mayor position or not. The reason for the lack of clarity in the law on this point is because when the voters voted on the measure in November of 2018, you did not have an elected mayor. So it says in the measure, city council members. So if you have an elected mayor, the question obviously then is, well, we now have an elected mayor, so does that term limit measure apply or not? And the answer is the law is not clear, but there is a path forward, which would be